Ancient Greece perfected a system of medicine that vanished for centuries. These were the Asclepieions, sacred temples where patients received treatment from both skilled physicians and the divine healer Asclepius himself. By the end of this story, you will understand how an entire library of advanced medical knowledge disappeared and why its loss still haunts us today. What happened to the detailed scrolls that recorded their cures? How could such influential institutions leave behind only fragments and folklore? We are about to follow the clues in a historical detective story spanning continents and millennia. What does the greatest loss of knowledge feel like? To understand the scale of what was lost, we need to see these places as they truly were. The Asclepieions were not simple shrines where people merely prayed for a miracle. They were sophisticated, state-funded medical complexes, the premier healthcare institutions of their day. Think of them as ancient wellness retreats, university teaching hospitals, and spiritual sanctuaries all rolled into one. Their reputation was so powerful that people traveled vast distances, often at great expense and hardship, to reach them. They were built deliberately in places believed to promote health, nestled in lush groves near pure mountain springs or on breezy hillsides overlooking the sea. The air was clean, the water was sacred, and the entire environment was designed to calm the mind and body before treatment even began. At the heart of each sanctuary was a unique structure called the abaton. This was a long, colonnaded hall, often partially open to the elements, where patients would undergo a ritual known as incubation. After purification rites and offerings to the god Asclepius, they would lie down to sleep on the skins of sacrificed animals. The belief was that in their dreams, the god himself or his sacred serpent would visit them. This serpent was not a symbol of fear, but of healing, often depicted coiled around the staff of Asclepius, an image that survives today as the universal symbol of medicine. In the dream, the god might perform a symbolic surgery, offer a diagnosis, or prescribe a treatment. Upon waking, the temple priests, who were also trained physicians, would interpret the dream and translate its symbolism into a practical medical regimen. This is the crucial fusion. The dream provided divine authority and psychological comfort, a powerful placebo in an age before many clinical cures, but the prescription that followed was grounded in observable empirical practice. The patient might be given a specific herbal remedy from the temple gardens, instructed to bathe in certain mineral-rich waters, or assigned a course of therapeutic exercise in the gymnasium. Some complexes even had small theaters, understanding that drama and music were vital for emotional and mental health, and critically, there were libraries. These housed scrolls detailing case histories, surgical techniques, botanical knowledge, and the outcomes of thousands of treatments. For nearly 1,000 years, these sanctuaries accumulated a vast, centralized database of medical experience, blending faith with a rigorous, almost scientific, method of observation and record-keeping. They were, in every sense, the lost hospitals of antiquity. This entire system of healing rested on the story of one extraordinary figure, a man who crossed the line between human skill and divine power. His name was Asclepius, and his origins are rooted in the complex drama of Greek mythology. He was the son of Apollo, the god of light, prophecy, and medicine, and a mortal princess named Coronis. The myths say Apollo himself taught his son the art of healing, but Asclepius possessed a talent that soon surpassed even his divine father's teachings. He traveled the land, becoming a legendary physician, healing the sick and wounded with such profound skill that he discovered a method to restore life to the dead. This was the pivotal moment, the act of hubris that changed everything. By reversing death itself, Asclepius had disrupted the natural order, a power the gods reserved for themselves alone. In response, the king of the gods, Zeus, struck the healer down with a thunderbolt. Yet, in a final twist that speaks to the deep respect for his gift, Zeus later placed Asclepius among the stars as the constellation Ophiuchus, the serpent-bearer, and allowed his worship to continue as a god. This transformation from a mortal hero struck down for his ambition to a revered deity is the core of his appeal. He was a god who understood human suffering intimately because he had once been human himself. His primary symbol, the rod of Asclepius, reflects this history. It is a simple staff with a single serpent coiled around it, representing renewal, wisdom, and the sacred animals that inhabited his temples. This is often confused with the caduceus, the staff with two snakes and wings carried by the messenger god Hermes, a symbol of commerce, not medicine. The distinction matters because the single serpent speaks to a focused, healing purpose. The cult of Asclepius grew from this powerful narrative. Patients arriving at an Asclepeion weren't just visiting a clinic, they were entering the sacred household of a compassionate, expert healer. They believed that during the ritual of incubation, Asclepius, or sometimes one of his divine children, would personally attend to them. His daughter Hygeia, whose name gives us the word hygiene, embodied preventative health and cleanliness. His other daughter, Panacea, represented the universal cure, the remedy for all ailments. To dream of these figures was to receive a prescription from the very source of medical wisdom. The dream might show the god applying a poultice or his serpent gently touching a wounded area. Upon waking, the temple priests would translate these divine visions into tangible treatments, creating a seamless bridge between faith in the supernatural and trust in a practiced empirical craft. The god was not a distant figure, but an active participant in every cure. The journey to an Asclepeion was a pilgrimage of both body and spirit. For a person suffering from a chronic ailment or a wound that would not heal, the decision to travel was momentous. They might sail for days across the Aegean Sea to reach the sanctuary at Kos, or make a long, dusty trek overland to the most famous site of all, the Asclepeion at Epidaurus. Upon arrival, the first impression was one of serene order. The air smelled of pine, incense, and the mineral tang of sacred springs. The sick were not treated as mere patients, but as sacred guests in the house of Asclepius. Before any medical intervention could begin, they had to be made ritually clean. This purification process was the essential first step, a symbolic washing away of spiritual and physical impurity. The pilgrim would bathe in cold, clear spring water, offer prayers, and present a sacrifice at the altar, often a rooster or a small cake made of dough. This offering was not a bribe to the god, but a gesture of respect and a tangible commitment to the healing process. Only then, cleansed and consecrated, would they be permitted to enter the most mysterious and critical space in the entire complex, the abaton. This was the hall of incubation, a long, quiet building where hope took the form of a dream. As night fell, they would lie down on a pallet, often the skin of the sacrificed animal, in a hall alongside other hopeful souls. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, and the scent of burning herbs meant to induce visions. The central belief was that in this sacred sleep, the god Asclepius himself, or perhaps one of his sacred serpents, would visit them. The dream was the divine consultation. It might be vividly literal, the god appearing to perform a surgery on the dreamer's afflicted body. More often, it was symbolic, a series of cryptic images that required expert interpretation. A dream of a snake coiling around a limb might indicate the need for a tight bandage or a tourniquet. A vision of being bathed in a certain spring could prescribe hydrotherapy. Dawn brought the moment of revelation. The dreamer would awaken and immediately recount their vision to the temple priests, who served a dual role as spiritual guides and trained physicians. This interpretation was the key that unlocked the treatment. The priest's cross referenced the dream's symbols with their vast repository of recorded case histories from the temple library. They were looking for patterns for previous patients who had similar dreams and were successfully cured by a specific regimen. The prescription that followed was remarkably practical. It could be a compound of specific herbs from the sanctuaries' gardens, instructions for a series of therapeutic baths in the complex's elaborate waterworks, or a prescribed diet. For some, the treatment involved exercise in the gymnasium or watching a play in the theater to lift the spirits. For others with more severe conditions, it might mean a real, physical surgery performed by skilled temple surgeons using tools found in archaeological digs. The entire experience was a seamless tapestry, weaving the profound psychological comfort of divine intervention with the tangible, empirical practices of ancient medicine. The god provided the diagnosis in the dream, but the cure came from the earth, the waters, and the hands of the healers. This powerful fusion of faith and practical care is what made the Asclepieions so effective and so beloved for centuries. Their success was recorded not in vague miracles, but in detailed stone tablets called iamata, which listed the names of patients, their ailments, their dreams, and their cures. These tablets were the proof of concept, the clinical trials of their age, and they formed the core of the medical knowledge that would one day vanish. Who were the healers who turned these divine dreams into tangible cures? The staff of an Asclepeion represented a unique fusion of roles that our modern world would keep strictly separate. There was no clear line between the priest and the physician, the therapist and the surgeon. These were all facets of a single vocation, the servant of Asclepeion. At the top were the head priests, who are also the lead physicians. They were educated men, fluent in the medical theories of the day, and responsible for the final interpretation of a patient's sacred dream. Assisting them were the therapeutai, a word that gives us our term therapist, but meant something closer to an attendant or a nurse. These individuals managed the daily care of patients, prepared remedies, and supervised the therapeutic baths and exercises. Then there were specialists, skilled surgeons who could set bones, perform trepanations to relieve pressure on the brain, or conduct other operations with tools of bronze and iron. Herbologists tended the extensive temple gardens, cultivating plants with known medicinal properties and compounding them into salves, potions, and poultices. And of course, there were the dream interpreters, experts in the symbolic language of the unconscious, who could decode a vision of a white dog or a golden cup into a specific medical recommendation. This blending of disciplines was the system's great strength. A treatment plan was not just a physical prescription, it was a holistic package addressing the body, the mind, and the spirit, all under one sacred roof. This environment naturally became a center for medical education. It is widely theorized that the most famous physician of antiquity, Hippocrates, who gave his name to the Hippocratic Oath, may have trained or practiced at the Asclepieion on the island of Kos. His approach, emphasizing careful observation of symptoms, diet, and natural causes of disease, echoes the empirical side of temple medicine, just stripped of its overtly religious framework. Other great medical minds of the ancient world likely passed through these institutions as well. The Asclepieions were not just clinics, they were the medical universities of their time, where knowledge was accumulated, tested against thousands of case histories, and passed down through generations of healer priests. They stood at a fascinating crossroads where faith invited the patient to believe in a cure, and empirical practice provided the actual tools to achieve it. This delicate balance of divine authority and hands-on science created a legacy of healing so powerful that its physical records were priceless. And that is precisely what makes their disappearance so devastating. These stone tablets of Epidaurus, the iamata, give us only the polished final chapter of the story. They are the public relations of ancient healing, carved in marble to advertise the god's power. A typical inscription might read, "Ambrosia of Athens, blind in one eye. She dreamed the god opened her eye and poured in a medicine. When day came, she departed well." It is a powerful testimony, a record of a cure, but it is maddeningly incomplete. Where is the medical record? What was in that medicine? How was it prepared? In what dosage? And for how long was it applied? The iamata tell us the patient got better, but they deliberately omit the practical craft that made it happen. This is the heart of the mystery. Institutions as sophisticated as the Asclepieions, which functioned for nearly 1,000 years and treated countless patients, could not have operated on faith and folklore alone. Behind the public miracles was a vast private library of working knowledge. Think of a modern hospital. It has its public success stories, but its real power lies in the detailed patient charts, the surgical procedure manuals, the pharmaceutical databases, and the decades of clinical research in its archives. The Asclepieions would have possessed the ancient equivalent. Where are the scrolls that recorded detailed patient histories, noting symptoms over time? Where are the herbals with precise illustrations of plants and instructions for their preparation? Where are the surgical texts describing techniques for setting complex fractures or treating wounds? This was the true intellectual wealth of the sanctuaries, the compiled experience of generations of healer priests, and it has almost entirely vanished. The loss creates a profound silence in our historical record, a black hole where a galaxy of medical understanding once shone. We are left with the celebratory headlines carved in stone, while the entire library of textbooks that explained how those headlines were achieved has been erased. The silence of those lost libraries is not absolute. We have one faint echo, a collection of texts that might whisper secrets of the temple methods. This is our first major clue, known as the Hippocratic connection. The Hippocratic corpus is a vast body of medical writings attributed to the great physician Hippocrates and his followers. The connection is tantalizing. Hippocrates himself was said to be an Asclepiad, a term meaning a descendant of the god Asclepius, which likely identified him as a member of the priest-physician class that served the temples. More concretely, he taught and practiced on the island of Kos, the site of one of the most renowned Asclepieions in the ancient world. It is almost impossible that his work developed in isolation from that influential institution. So the theory goes that the knowledge contained within the Hippocratic corpus may represent a secularization, a filtering of temple practices into a more philosophical and observational framework. We can see this transformation most clearly in a famous text called On the Sacred Disease. This treatise is a direct assault on the idea that conditions like epilepsy were caused by divine punishment or visitation. The author argues forcefully that this so-called sacred disease has natural causes in the brain, and its origins are no more divine than any other illness. This seems, on the surface, to be a complete rejection of the Asclepieian model, but look closer. The text does not deny the reality of the symptoms or the suffering. Instead, it redirects the search for a cure from the realm of pure ritual to the realm of physical observation and natural remedy. This could be seen not as a contradiction, but as an evolution. It takes the empirical data gathered from thousands of temple cases, the careful noting of symptoms, the trial of various treatments, and strips away the layer of divine dream interpretation, focusing solely on the material results. The temples believed a god prescribed the cure in a dream, but the cure itself was always a physical thing, an herb, a diet, a surgery. The Hippocratic approach simply starts from the physical cause and works forward, bypassing the dream. It is the same body of practical knowledge viewed through a different lens, so these texts might be our best surviving fragments of the lost medical manuals. When a Hippocratic scroll describes a technique for setting a dislocated shoulder or details the healing properties of willow bark, we might be reading the distilled, secularized textbook version of a treatment first perfected and recorded in the archives of an Asclepeion. The god has left the room, but the medicine remains. But the Hippocratic texts are a whisper, an echo filtered through philosophy. For a louder, more direct voice from the temples themselves, we must travel to the Peloponnese and walk among the ruins of Epidaurus. Here, in the very dust of the most celebrated Asclepeion, we find our second major clue. Carved into great stone stelae that once stood for all pilgrims to see are over 70 accounts of healing miracles, known as the Epidaurian Iamata. These are not medical charts, they are advertisements of divine power, but hidden within their fantastical tales may be coded messages about real medical skill. One inscription tells of a man named Ambrosius who was blind. He came to the sanctuary skeptical, mocking the cures of others. In his dream, the god Asclepius appeared, promised to restore his sight, but demanded a payment of silver coins to be left at the altar. When Ambrosius awoke, he could still see nothing. The god then appeared again in a second dream, opened his eyelids and poured a medicine directly into them. At dawn, Ambrosius could see, but he tried to leave without paying the promised silver. Immediately, he was struck blind once more. Returning to sleep in the abaton, he had a final dream where the god healed him again, and this time Ambrosius paid his debt and left cured. Another stele records the case of a warrior named Hippocrates who had carried the spearhead of an enemy embedded in his jaw for 6 long years. During incubation, he dreamed the god simply pulled the metal fragment out and placed it in his hands. Waking up, Hippocrates found the spearhead resting in his palms, his jaw miraculously whole. Perhaps the strangest account is of a woman from the town of Troezen named Ithmonica who came to the temple praying for a child. She fell asleep and dreamed the god asked if she wanted to become pregnant. She said yes, and he then told her she already was pregnant and that her child would be a boy. He then asked if she wanted any other favor. She requested her mother's health be restored, and the god agreed. When Ithmonica awoke and returned home, she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. But the inscription adds one bizarre, haunting detail, that she had already been pregnant for 5 whole years. On the surface, these read like pure religious fantasy, impossible miracles designed to inspire awe and attract more pilgrims. But what if we look at them not as literal events, but as stylized, symbolic public relations? The story of Ambrosius and the medicine poured into his eyes could be a dramatic retelling of a successful ophthalmic surgery or the application of a potent herbal salve, framed as divine action to protect the temple's intellectual property and spiritual authority. The tale of Hippocrates and the spearhead is not magic. It is a textbook description of a skilled surgeon removing a deeply embedded foreign object, a procedure that would have been life-saving and required immense precision. The god's hands in the dream are the surgeon's hands in the operating room, and the woman pregnant for 5 years. To a modern ear, it sounds like folklore, but to an ancient physician, it might encode a real and tragic obstetric condition. It could describe a missed abortion where a fetus dies but is not expelled, or a severe case of fibroid tumors mistaken for a pregnancy, with the god's intervention representing a successful procedure to finally resolve the condition. These inscriptions were the temple's public-facing resume. They could not simply list surgical success rates or herbal formulas, as that would demystify their power and make their knowledge vulnerable to theft. Instead, they wrapped their proven medical capabilities in the irresistible cloak of divine narrative. The miracle was the headline, but the subtext was a clear message to any suffering pilgrim: come here, for we have successfully treated blindness, removed embedded weapons, and resolved impossible childbirth. The stone stelae of Epidaurus are therefore a cryptic library in plain sight. They are not the lost medical texts, but they are their shadow, a public monument built from the same knowledge that filled the private scrolls. They tell us that behind the curtain of the sacred dream, something tangible and profoundly skilled was actually happening. A third and crucial clue lies not in Greece, but across the Aegean Sea in the ancient city of Pergamon. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, this magnificent city had become a powerhouse of the Hellenistic world, and its leaders sought to make it a beacon of culture and knowledge. At the heart of this ambition was its own Asclepeion, a sprawling sanctuary built into a hillside, complete with sacred springs, a theater, and a library said to hold 200,000 scrolls. This was no mere temple, it was a direct competitor to the legendary Library of Alexandria, and it positioned Pergamon as the new epicenter of medical learning in the Mediterranean. As the older Greek sanctuaries like Epidorus and Kos began to slowly fade from prominence, a tantalizing possibility emerges. Did the scholars and physicians of Pergamon, in their quest to build the greatest repository of knowledge on earth, actively collect the medical scrolls from those older institutions? It is a compelling thought. The great libraries of antiquity did not just write new books, they were voracious collectors, sending agents across the known world to acquire, copy, and preserve older texts. The library at Pergamon, with its specific focus on medicine due to the adjacent sanctuary, would have had every reason to seek out the original case histories and treatment manuals from the founding Asclepieions. If any single place in the ancient world held a consolidated archive of that lost medical wisdom, it was likely here within the vaults of Pergamon's library. This repository became the training ground for one of history's most prolific medical writers, a man whose work might be our final, best echo of the vanished texts, Galen of Pergamon. Born in the year 129, Galen studied at the city's Asclepieion, immersing himself in its vast collections. He then traveled widely, dissecting animals, treating gladiators whose wounds gave him a living textbook of anatomy, and voraciously reading every medical text he could find. Over his lifetime, he wrote thousands of pages, synthesizing everything he had learned from his predecessors. His writings are a monumental synthesis of all ancient medical knowledge that had survived up to his time. And this is the key. When Galen quotes an older physician or references a treatment, he is often giving us a fragment of a text that no longer exists independently. His voluminous work acts like a sponge, having absorbed ideas, formulas, and techniques from centuries of practice, very possibly including the core teachings preserved first in the older Asclepieions and later in the library at Pergamon. So we are left with a profound chain of custody. The original scrolls from Epidorus and Kos may have been gathered in Pergamon. Galen then studied them, distilled their knowledge, and embedded it within his own enormous body of work. Then, the library of Pergamon itself was eventually scattered and lost, its physical scrolls decaying or destroyed. But Galen's writings, copied and recopied, survived through the Middle Ages in the Arab world and later in Europe, becoming the unchallenged medical authority for over 1,000 years. In a very real sense, the ghost of the Asclepieian libraries lived on within Galen's texts. The problem is, it is a ghost filtered through a single, brilliant but often arrogant mind. Galen was not a passive scribe, he was a forceful interpreter who constantly argued with his predecessors and promoted his own theories. So when we read Galen today, we are not reading the lost scrolls themselves, we are reading one man's lecture notes on them, complete with his own corrections and commentary. We hear the voice of the Asclepieions, but it is muffled, speaking to us from behind the imposing figure of their last great student. The library at Pergamon represents the last known fortress where the complete archive might have been held, and Galen is our final witness to its content. After this, the trail grows colder, and the forces that would erase this knowledge from the world begin to gather. Dreams were not just a side effect of the healing process, they were the central diagnostic tool. The stone inscriptions present the god's nocturnal visit not as a suggestion but as the cure itself. A man dreams of the god touching his wounded leg and wakes up healed. This seems miraculous, but to understand it, we must step into the ancient mind. They believed dreams were a direct channel to divine truth, a state where the body's ailments could be symbolically revealed and addressed by a higher power. The dream was the consultation, and the god was the ultimate physician. Yet, for this system to work for 1,000 years, there had to be a method behind the mystery. This is where the priest-physicians performed their most subtle art, dream interpretation. It was likely a sophisticated, two-part process blending psychology and physical medicine. First, consider the patient's state. They arrived after days of travel, ritual purification, and intense anticipation. Lying in the quiet, incense-filled abaton, their mind was primed, focused entirely on their illness. In this heightened state, their symptoms and deepest anxieties could easily manifest in the symbolic language of dreams. A stabbing pain might become a vision of a spear. A spreading infection might appear as a crawling serpent. The dream was not a random fantasy, it was the body's complaint, translated into a story the conscious mind could remember and report. Second, the interpretation was not guesswork. The priests had manuals, now lost, that catalogued these symbolic connections. They were the psychoanalysts of their age, trained to decode the imagery. When a patient described a dream of a heavy stone on their chest, the priest might diagnose a respiratory or cardiac issue, prescribing specific breathing exercises or herbs to relieve pressure. A dream of being bound could point to muscular tension or paralysis, leading to a regimen of massage and hydrotherapy. The genius of the system was its holistic approach. It acknowledged what modern medicine now confirms, that the mind and body are inextricably linked, that stress can manifest as physical pain, and that belief in a cure can powerfully influence recovery. The dream provided a safe, symbolic space for the patient to confront their illness, and the priest's interpretation transformed that confrontation into a tangible, actionable plan. The god provided the authority, but the treatment came from the earth. This means the lost texts of the Asclepieions were not merely lists of herbs and surgeries. They almost certainly contained detailed manuals on this psychosomatic link, guides for training priests in the art of listening to the body's metaphorical language. They understood that healing a wound required more than a poultice, it required calming the fear that came with it. Their entire method was a precursor to mind-body medicine, recognizing that a diagnosis delivered through a sacred dream could carry more weight and inspire more compliance than a simple instruction from a mortal healer. The real loss, then, is not just a collection of forgotten recipes, but an entire school of thought on the interconnectedness of human health, a wisdom that viewed the dream as a diagnostic window and treated the patient's story as a vital clue. The sacred precinct of an Asclepieion was a living, breathing pharmacy. This walled sanctuary, known as the Hieron, was far more than a collection of beautiful buildings. It was a meticulously curated healing landscape. Every path, every grove, every sun-drenched terrace was planted with purpose. Walking through it, a patient would be surrounded by the very ingredients of their potential cure, a sensory immersion in the tools of medicine. The air itself carried the sharp, clean scent of mint, known to soothe stomach ailments and clear the mind. Climbing vines of ivy, used in poultices for burns and inflammation, covered the shaded colonnades. In carefully tended plots, the temple herbologists cultivated a profound botanical wisdom. The milky sap of the opium poppy offered the only real relief from agonizing pain, a powerful anesthetic for surgeries or terminal illness. The mysterious mandrake root, with its human-like shape, was a potent sedative and painkiller, though its harvesting was surrounded by ritual to avoid its toxic properties. And perhaps most significantly, there were stands of willow trees. For centuries, healers had used their bark, brewing it into teas or grinding it into powders to reduce fever and alleviate pain. We now know why willow bark contains a compound called salicin, the natural precursor to the acetylsalicylic acid in modern aspirin. This was not folk magic, it was early, effective pharmacology. The lost texts of the Asclepieions almost certainly contained detailed manuals we would call herbals. These would have been the master reference guides for the temple gardens. Imagine a scroll carefully illustrated with painted images of each plant at various stages of growth. It would detail the ideal soil, the amount of sun and water required, and the precise lunar cycle or season for harvesting to capture the peak potency of the roots, leaves, or flowers. Most crucially, it would provide the formulas, the recipes for turning raw botanicals into medicine, how to crush mandrake root and mix it with wine to create a sleeping draught. The exact method for preparing a willow bark decoction, simmered for how long, strained through what cloth, and administered in what dose for a fever versus a joint ache. This was proprietary, institutional knowledge, the culmination of generations of trial, observation, and recorded results. And while the original temple scrolls are gone, their ghost lingers in a later text that survived the fires of history. Centuries after the Asclepieions faded, a Greek physician in the Roman army named Dioscorides compiled a work called De Materia Medica. This 5-volume encyclopedia described over 600 plants and their medicinal uses. Many scholars believe Dioscorides did not invent this knowledge. He catalogued it, drawing from the accumulated wisdom of earlier Greek sources, very likely including the lost herbals of the great healing sanctuaries. His work was copied and recopied throughout the Middle Ages, becoming the foundational botanical text for over 1,000 years. So when a medieval monk in a monastery garden consulted an illustrated herbal to treat a sick brother, he might have been following a chain of instruction that began with a priest-physician in the sacred groves of Epidorus, tending a willow tree and recording its secrets on a papyrus scroll that we can no longer read. But the true test of a healer's skill was not in the garden, it was in the operating room. While the stone inscriptions celebrated divine miracles, the silent testimony of archaeology speaks of a different, more tangible kind of magic. Excavations at sites like Epidorus and Corinth have unearthed collections of bronze and iron instruments that are startlingly familiar. There are scalpels with finely honed blades for making precise incisions. There are forceps, both toothed and smooth, for gripping and extracting foreign objects or holding tissues. Delicate probes called spacilla were used to explore wounds. And there are bone levers, sturdy tools for setting fractures and manipulating shattered limbs back into alignment. These are not the tools of a shaman performing ritual, they are the instruments of a skilled surgeon practicing a demanding craft. Each one is a physical clue, a piece of evidence that contradicts the simple miracle narrative and points toward a vast, missing library of practical knowledge. The votive inscriptions might say a god pulled a spearhead from a jaw in a dream, but the forceps found in the temple dirt tell us how it was really done. So what would the lost surgical manuals have contained? We can reconstruct their likely chapters from the tools and from later medical writings that probably drew from them. One vital section would have detailed the treatment of compound fractures, a common and life-threatening injury. The manual would describe how to clean the wound with vinegar or wine, how to use the bone levers to carefully maneuver the broken ends back into place, and how to construct a rigid splint from wood and linen bandages to hold everything stable during the long months of healing. Another chapter would cover trepanation, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole in the skull. This was not mere superstition. It was a deliberate intervention, likely used to relieve pressure from a severe head injury or to treat what they perceived as madness. The manual would have specified the different types of drills and scrapers, the careful avoidance of the suture lines where the skull bones meet, and the post-operative care to prevent infection. There would have been detailed instructions for wound management, explaining how to suture a deep gash with linen thread, how to pack a wound with medicated honey for its antibacterial properties, and how to recognize the signs of gangrene. The texts might even have described procedures for simple amputations, a last resort to save a life from a spreading infection, detailing the use of a tight tourniquet, the swift cut, and the cauterization of the stump with a red-hot iron to seal the blood vessels. These manuals would not have been abstract theory. They would have been step-by-step guides, likely accompanied by detailed diagrams drawn on papyrus or vellum, showing the angle of an incision, the placement of a splint, or the correct grip for a bone lever. They represented the accumulated, hard-won experience of generations, the knowledge of what worked and, just as importantly, what failed. Each successful surgery recorded in the Iamata as a divine visitation was in reality the product of this meticulous physical craft. The god provided the patient's faith and the surgeon's confidence, but the forceps did the work. The loss of these technical manuals is perhaps the most acute of all, for they represent the hands-on, life-saving engineering of ancient medicine, a discipline that moved beyond herbs and dreams into the daring realm of physical intervention. The surgical tools tell us what the healers could do, but they cannot tell us why their libraries fell silent. To understand that, we must follow a trail of ash and ruin. The first major blow likely came not from a single event, but from a slow, grinding force, the relentless expansion of the Roman Republic. In the year 146 before the Common Era, the Roman general Lucius Mummius laid siege to the wealthy, defiant city of Corinth. When the city fell, the Romans made a brutal example of it. They slaughtered the men, sold the women and children into slavery, and then systematically looted and burned the entire city to the ground. Corinth was not just a political rival, it was a major cultural and intellectual hub, and it housed a significant Asclepieion. The destruction was so complete that the site lay abandoned for a century. In that inferno, any medical scrolls housed in the temple or in private collections would have been incinerated, their unique knowledge turned to smoke in a single day. This was not an isolated incident. Roman conquest across Greece and Asia Minor often followed this pattern, where the libraries and archives of a conquered people were treated as spoils of war, either destroyed as a symbol of subjugation or crated up and shipped to Rome, where they could be scattered, lost, or simply left to molder in storage. Each fallen city represented another potential repository of medical knowledge going up in flames or vanishing into the chaotic Roman capital. But the greatest symbolic loss, the one that haunts history, is the fire at the Library of Alexandria. While we now know the library likely suffered a long, slow decline through multiple smaller fires and neglect, the popular legend of its catastrophic burning endures for a reason. It represents the fragility of concentrated knowledge. Alexandria was the ultimate repository, a library that aimed to hold a copy of every known book in the world. It is almost certain that copies of medical text from the Asclepieions or the works of physicians who trained there would have been collected within its vast halls. If a fire did rage through its papyrus collections, it would have consumed not just originals, but the safety copies, the duplicates that could have preserved this knowledge elsewhere. Whether by sudden flame or gradual decay, Alexandria's decline meant one less great fortress protecting the legacy of ancient healing. Yet the most systematic and final end came not from war or accident, but from a profound shift in belief. With the rise of Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire in the 4th century, the old pagan gods were declared demons and their temples were ordered closed. In the year 391, the Emperor Theodosius issued a series of decrees banning all pagan worship. For the Asclepieions, this was a death sentence. These were not just medical centers, they were first and foremost the sacred houses of the god Asclepieion. To continue their work was now illegal. Imperial soldiers and zealous monks moved from sanctuary to sanctuary. Statues of Asclepieion and his serpent were toppled and smashed. The altars were shattered. The sacred springs were either consecrated to Christian saints or left to silt up. The great libraries attached to these temples were emptied. The fate of the scrolls inside is the final, quiet tragedy. Some were undoubtedly burned as pagan filth. Others, made of valuable papyrus or parchment, were scraped clean and reused, a process called palimpsesting, where a medical treatise might be overwritten with a Christian sermon, the old knowledge literally erased to make room for the new. But perhaps the most common fate was simple, slow neglect. Once the priests and physicians were expelled, the doors were sealed, roofs leaked, dampness set in. In the dark, abandoned scriptoriums, the papyrus scrolls, organic and fragile, would have succumbed to mold, insects, and the relentless decay of time. They did not vanish in a dramatic blaze, but in a silent, centuries-long sigh, turning to dust on their shelves because there was no one left who cared to preserve them. The combined forces of conquest, fire, and religious revolution created a perfect storm of oblivion, ensuring that the detailed medical texts of the Asclepieions would pass from history, leaving behind only stone inscriptions, a handful of surgical tools, and the ghost of their wisdom in later, filtered works. Even as the old temples were being sealed, a new kind of healing was taking root within their very walls. The transition from Asclepieion to Christian church was not always a story of violent destruction, but often one of careful, deliberate repurposing. This process, known as Interpretatio Christiana, or Christian interpretation, saw the powerful symbols and practices of the old faith systematically rebranded to serve the new. The sacred spring where pilgrims once bathed for Asclepius might be reconsecrated in the name of a healing saint. The abaton, the hall of dreams, could become the nave of a small basilica. And the god of medicine himself was replaced by a pair of twin brothers, the saints Cosmas and Damian. These saints, who were said to have practiced medicine without charge, became the new patron physicians of the Christian world. Their miracles, recorded in later texts, bear a striking and telling resemblance to the old Iamata inscriptions. They perform dream visions and miraculous surgeries, often while the patient is asleep, seamlessly adopting the framework of the very system they were replacing. This was a brilliant, pragmatic strategy. You could not simply erase 1,000 years of healing tradition from the public memory. It was far more effective to absorb it, to redirect the deep-seated faith in a place's power toward a Christian figurehead. The location remained a destination for the sick. The rituals felt familiar, but the divine authority had been transferred. Within this transformation lies a fragile thread of preservation. The practical knowledge, the hands-on craft of the temple physicians did not necessarily vanish. It likely found a new home within the walls of early monastic communities. Monasteries became the new centers of medical care in the medieval world, with their own infirmaries and herb gardens. The monks, who saw caring for the sick as a sacred duty, would have had every reason to preserve any useful medical texts they could find. When a monastery was established on or near the site of a former Asclepieion, it is plausible that any surviving scrolls or codices were taken into the monastic library. There, a scribe might carefully copy a recipe for a pain-relieving salve or instructions for setting a bone. But here is the critical, subtle loss. In copying, the scribe would almost certainly edit. References to Asclepius, invocations to his daughters Hygeia and Panacea, and the entire philosophical framework that linked the dream to the diagnosis would be scrubbed away as pagan superstition. What remained was a stripped-down, practical recipe, a surgical technique divorced from its original context. The why behind the treatment, the holistic understanding of the dream as a diagnostic tool, the spiritual significance of the healing environment was discarded. The knowledge was saved, but its soul was removed. The link to its source, to the accumulated wisdom of the Asclepieion system, was irrevocably broken. The scroll became a list of instructions without its founding philosophy, a body without a spirit. So the libraries did not always burn. Sometimes they were quietly censored, their most vital connections redacted by a well-meaning hand, leaving behind a ghost of practical advice that would travel through the ages, its origins forever obscured. While the libraries of the West fell dark, a brilliant light was kindling in the East. As the great Christian monasteries were preserving stripped-down recipes, an entirely different civilization was undertaking the most ambitious project of translation and synthesis the world had ever seen. This was the Islamic Golden Age, spanning from the 8th to the 10th centuries, centered in the intellectual capitals of Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba. Here, caliphs and scholars were driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge, regardless of its origin. They established vast libraries called houses of wisdom and funded a massive, systematic effort to seek out and translate every significant scientific and philosophical work from the ancient world, especially from the Greeks. This presents us with a tantalizing possibility. If the original scrolls from the Asclepieions were already dust in Greece, could their essence have found a second life in Arabic? The translation movement focused overwhelmingly on the great synthesizers, the authors who had already compiled earlier knowledge. The primary targets were Galen, whose works alone accounted for over 100 texts, and the Hippocratic corpus. A scholar named Hunayn ibn Ishaq became the master architect of this effort. Fluent in Greek, Syriac, and Arabic, he didn't just translate word for word. He led a team that critically edited, corrected, and commented on these ancient works, often comparing multiple Greek manuscripts to produce the most accurate version possible. Through his efforts and those of his successors, the entire body of Galenic and Hippocratic medicine was transferred into Arabic, where it was then studied, expanded upon, and refined by physicians like al-Razi and Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna. So the question becomes a very specific and haunting one. Did Hunayn and his colleagues have access to any unique Greek texts that we no longer possess today? Could a manuscript from a forgotten corner of an Anatolian monastery, containing treatments not found in the mainstream Galenic canon, have found its way to Baghdad? It is entirely plausible. The translators were voracious collectors, scouring the remains of the Byzantine world for manuscripts. Within a translated Arabic text, we might find a footnote, a case description, or a recipe attributed to an otherwise unknown Greek source. That source could theoretically be a fragment from an Asclepieian library, a scroll that escaped the fires of Corinth or the damp of a sealed temple, only to be translated and then lost again, leaving its ghost only in Arabic. The challenge is monumental. These Arabic medical encyclopedias are vast. Avicenna's canon of medicine alone is over 1 million words. Buried within its systematic chapters could be a reference to a dream-based diagnosis or a compound of herbs attributed to the temple healers of Kos, presented without fanfare as just another piece of medical data. Finding such a needle in a haystack requires scholars who are not only fluent in classical Arabic, but also deeply familiar with the entire Greek medical tradition, to spot the anomaly, the piece that doesn't quite fit the Galenic mold. It is a detective story played out across 2 millennia and 3 languages, so this Arabic bridge is both a beacon of hope and a source of profound frustration. It saved the core of classical medicine, which is why we know the names of Hippocrates and Galen today. But it may have also saved unique fragments that slipped through other cracks, fragments we have yet to recognize for what they truly are. Lost echoes waiting in plain sight within the majestic pages of a medieval Arabic manuscript. This profound absence leaves a hole in the very ground where we search for answers. Archaeologists have spent over a century meticulously excavating the great healing sanctuaries, brushing dust from the foundations of the abaton and mapping the outlines of sacred springs. At Epidaurus, Pergamon, and Kos, they have uncovered magnificent theaters, intricate mosaics, and those stone stelae proclaiming miracles. They have found the surgical tools, the votive offerings, and the sleeping halls. But they have never, in all that digging, found what would be the ultimate treasure, a sealed room, a hidden cellar, a single clay jar overflowing with the papyrus scrolls of a medical library. This silence in the soil is deafening. It forces us to confront a difficult truth. The existence of these advanced texts is something we must largely infer, not something we can hold in our hand. We know they existed because the sophistication of the institutions demands it, just as we know a modern hospital must have medical charts, even if we never find them. The contrast with another ancient discovery only deepens the mystery. In the year 1748, at a Roman seaside town called Herculaneum, buried by the same volcanic eruption that destroyed Pompeii, workers discovered an opulent villa. As they excavated, they found room after room filled with what appeared to be lumps of charcoal. These were in fact papyrus scrolls, carbonized by the superheated gases of Mount Vesuvius. While brittle and fused, the villa of the papyri proved that entire libraries could be preserved in the ground, frozen in a single catastrophic moment. Its scrolls, mostly works of Greek philosophy, were painstakingly unrolled and read centuries later. So why has no such cache ever been found at an Asclepieion? The answer lies in the cruel chemistry of preservation and the nature of the disaster that befell these places. The volcanic ash that entombed Herculaneum created an anaerobic, airtight seal, a perfect, if accidental, time capsule. The end for the Asclepieions was not a sudden, preserving cataclysm, but a slow death by abandonment and decay. Their libraries were not buried in an instant, they were left to the elements. And in the climate of mainland Greece, papyrus is an enemy of time. Papyrus is made from the pith of a water plant pressed into sheets. It is highly susceptible to moisture. In a damp environment, it becomes a feast for mold and fungi, disintegrating into a dark, unreadable pulp within decades. In a dry environment, it becomes brittle and crumbles to dust at the slightest touch. For a scroll to survive 2,000 years, it requires a near-miraculous set of conditions, a perfectly stable, dry, and sealed environment like the deserts of Egypt or the airless tomb of a volcano. The temples of Greece, with their seasonal rains, humidity, and eventual roof collapses, offered the opposite, a perfect recipe for oblivion. This means the physical record of their knowledge was almost certainly organic and ephemeral. The scrolls were used, referenced, copied, and eventually they simply wore out and were not replaced. When the temples were finally closed, any remaining texts were left to complete their natural decay cycle, turning back into the earth from which they came. So the archaeological silence is not proof the libraries never existed. It is proof of their profound vulnerability. The stones of the sanctuary endure, but the words that gave them purpose have evaporated, leaving us to piece together their ghost from surgical bronze, from carved miracles, and from the echoes in later texts. We are left searching for a shadow, knowing the object that cast it has long since turned to dust. The story of a blind boy healed by a goddess in his sleep is not just a miracle, it is a riddle. This specific inscription from Epidaurus is one of the most famous, a classic tale of divine intervention. But what if we read it not as a religious text but as a coded medical report? Historians and physicians today are attempting exactly that, treating the iamata like ancient ciphers that need to be broken. The inscription describes the goddess applying a salve to the boy's eyes. In the language of the miracle, this is a magical act. In the language of a lost medical manual, this could be a precise clinical procedure. What was in that salve? We have clues from other sources about ancient ophthalmology. Greek physicians knew of substances with real medicinal properties. They used compounds made from the mineral antimony, finely ground, as an astringent to treat eye infections. They prepared ointments from the resin of the terebinth tree, which has mild antiseptic qualities. Even honey, a known antibacterial agent, was commonly used in wound dressings and could have been part of an eye treatment. So the goddess's salve might have been a carefully formulated antibiotic or anti-inflammatory paste. Its divine origin a way to describe its remarkable, observed effectiveness. Then there is the dream itself. The boy is asleep when the treatment is applied. This is the core of the mystery. Was he literally asleep? Could this be a record of one of the earliest uses of surgical anesthesia? We know the Asclepieian healers had access to powerful sedatives like opium and mandrake. It is entirely plausible that a patient, especially a child undergoing a delicate procedure, would be given a soporific draught to induce a twilight sleep, reducing pain and panic. In that drugged, suggestible state, the application of the medicated salve by a priest-physician could easily be remembered and recounted as a divine visitation in a dream. The dream becomes a metaphor for the patient's subjective, altered experience of the treatment, a way to narrate a traumatic or complex medical event through the safer, more wondrous lens of mythology. This process of decoding is our most direct form of guesswork. Each element of the miracle story is a potential container for a real-world medical fact. The goddess represents the healer. The dream represents the altered state of the patient or the private nature of the treatment. The salve represents the pharmacological compound. By stripping away the layer of sacred narrative, we attempt to glimpse the clinical reality beneath. It is an imperfect science, of course. We are interpreting a symbol that was never meant to be interpreted literally, trying to reconstruct a detailed recipe from a parable. But this effort is crucial because it forces us to engage with these texts not as fairy tales, but as the only surviving fragments of a vast, ruined library. Every decoded symbol is a recovered sentence from a medical text we can no longer read. The blind boy's story becomes a case study, a single patient file that survived the burning of the archives because it was carved in stone for all to see, while the manual that explained the salve's formula turned to dust in a room just next door. Of all the great healing sanctuaries, one stands apart as the most likely cradle of the lost archive. This is the Asclepieion of Kos, a breathtaking complex constructed on 3 vast terraces carved into a hillside, each level offering a commanding view of the deep blue Aegean Sea. Unlike the more isolated Epidaurus, Kos felt connected to the wider world, a crossroads of trade and ideas. But its true significance lies not just in its architecture, but in a name forever linked to its grounds, Hippocrates. Tradition holds that the great physician was born on Kos around 460 years before the Common Era, and that he taught and practiced within the shadow of this very sanctuary. He was, according to ancient sources, an Asclepiad, a term meaning a descendant of the god, which identified him as part of the priest-physician class that served the temple. This direct personal connection transforms Kos from a mere archaeological site into the probable birthplace of a medical revolution. The sanctuary itself was a marvel of therapeutic design. Patients entered on the lowest terrace, a space for initial purification and public gatherings. They then climbed a grand staircase to the second level, the heart of the healing ritual. Here stood the altar of Asclepius and, most importantly, the abaton, the long hall where sacred dreams were sought. Finally, the highest terrace housed the grand temple of Asclepius himself, a place of ultimate offering and reflection. The entire journey was a physical ascent mirroring the hoped-for ascent from illness to health, all conducted in an environment of staggering beauty and serenity, with the sound of the sea and the scent of medicinal herbs carried on the breeze. This sanctuary thrived for nearly 800 years, from the 4th century before the Common Era well into the Roman period. For all those centuries, it would have been accumulating records, a living library of case histories and treatments. If any single place was the intellectual heart of the system, the central repository from which scrolls might have been copied and distributed to other sites like Pergamon, it was almost certainly Kos. And this leads us to the most enduring legacy possibly born within its walls, not a scroll but a promise. The Hippocratic Oath, that famous vow of medical ethics, begins by swearing by Apollo the physician and Asclepius. This is not a casual invocation, it is a direct link to the temple's gods. Scholars have long debated its origins, but a compelling theory suggests the oath may have begun not as a general professional code, but as a specific initiation ritual for physicians entering the Asclepieian community on Kos. It would have bound them to the ethical standards honed within that system, to treat the sick to the best of their ability, to do no harm, and to protect patient privacy. The oath frames medical practice as a sacred trust, a concept perfectly at home in an institution that blended divine duty with empirical care. So when we imagine the lost library of Kos, we should picture not only shelves of papyrus detailing herbal compounds and surgical techniques, but also the foundational scroll that held this oath, the ethical backbone of the entire enterprise, a document that outlived the temple walls and continues to echo in medical schools across the world today. But what if the library we have been searching for never actually existed in the form we imagine? This is the quiet, compelling argument made by a growing number of scholars. They propose a different kind of loss, not of vast written archives, but of a living, breathing, oral tradition. In this view, the true repository of Asclepieian knowledge was not a scroll on a shelf, but the memory and hands of the healer priests themselves, passed meticulously from master to apprentice within the closed, guild-like families known as the Asclepieions. Think of it like a master chef's recipes. The most prized techniques, the subtle adjustments, the secret ingredients, are often never written down. They are taught through demonstration, through touch, through years of standing at the side of an expert. The apprentice learns by doing, by watching how the master grinds a specific herb, by feeling the exact pressure needed to set a bone, by memorizing the stories of past patients and their outcomes. In such a system, written texts might have been minimal, serving as personal aid memoirs for senior physicians, perhaps a few notes on a wax tablet or a scrap of papyrus with a shorthand list of ingredients. These were not textbooks for public study, but private prompts for a knowledge that resided primarily in people, not on pages. This idea forces us to reconsider the entire nature of the mystery. We have been picturing the burning of the Library of Alexandria as the great tragedy, but perhaps the real tragedy was the slow dying out of the Asclepiad lineages themselves. When the temples were closed by imperial decree, this unbroken chain of master to apprentice transmission was severed. The last generation of healers took their unwritten knowledge with them to the grave, and with no apprentices to teach, the living library simply ceased to exist. The practical skills, the nuanced interpretations of dreams, the precise methods for compounding medicines, all of it evaporated because it was never fully committed to a permanent, durable form. This pattern echoes other ancient mysteries. We look at the breathtaking masonry of the pyramids or the precise astronomical alignments of Stonehenge and assume there must have been detailed architectural plans, complex engineering manuals. Yet no such documents have ever been found. It is entirely possible that this monumental knowledge was also transmitted orally and through practical apprenticeship, learned by doing and refined over generations until the techniques became second nature. So our search shifts. We are not just looking for a single grand library that went up in flames. We are searching for the faint echoes of a dispersed oral wisdom that was gradually, fragment by fragment, absorbed into the wider stream of Greek medicine. When Hippocrates or later Galen wrote down medical principles, they may have been giving a formal, written structure to practices that had been circulating in spoken form for centuries within these temple families. The lost texts, then, might be a metaphor. They represent the intimate, experiential knowledge that can never truly be captured in writing, the healer's instinct honed over a lifetime which vanished when its last living guardians fell silent. The echoes of those silent temples did not simply fade into history. They resonate in the very foundations of how we think about health and healing today, a legacy written not in recovered scrolls but in enduring principles. Walk into any modern hospital and you might be surprised by the ghosts of the Asclepieion. The design of a peaceful, restorative environment is no accident. Hospitals now prioritize natural light, quiet gardens, and calming art, understanding that a patient's surroundings directly impact recovery. This is a direct descendant of the sacred groves and serene terraces of Kos and Epidaurus, the ancient recognition that healing begins with a calm mind in a clean, pleasant space. We have replaced the sacred spring with advanced hydrotherapy pools, but the core idea remains: the environment is part of the treatment. Then there is the profound understanding of the mind-body connection, which the temple priests practiced through dream interpretation. Modern medicine now fully acknowledges psychosomatic illness, where mental stress manifests as physical pain, and fields like psychoneuroimmunology study how our thoughts and emotions directly influence our immune system. The Asclepieions' ritual of incubation was an early, powerful form of guided therapy, using the patient's own subconscious to unlock a path to wellness. Today, we might use cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness meditation instead of interpreting a dream of a serpent. but the goal is strikingly similar: to align the mind state with the body's healing. The holistic approach, treating the whole person rather than just a set of symptoms, is another cornerstone they pioneered. They didn't just set a broken leg, they prescribed therapeutic exercise, a specific diet, and perhaps a comedy in the theater to lift the spirit. Modern integrative medicine seeks to do the same, combining clinical treatment with nutrition, physical therapy, and mental health support. Even the phenomenon of medical tourism has ancient roots. People once traveled across the Mediterranean to reach Epidaurus, just as patients today journey to world-renowned clinics in other countries, seeking expertise and hope that feels unavailable at home. The journey itself is an act of commitment to getting well, and most visibly, the symbol of their craft endures. Look at the logo of the World Health Organization, or the insignia of countless medical associations, ambulance services, and pharmacy signs. You will see the rod of Asclepius, a single serpent coiled around a simple staff. It is a direct inheritance, a 2,000-year-old emblem that still says healing. It is a quiet, daily reminder that our modern medical edifice, for all its technology, is built upon an ancient human ideal, compassion fused with practical skill. So the true legacy of the lost texts is not a forgotten surgical technique or a magical herbal recipe. It is something far more pervasive, a set of foundational ideas about what healing should be, an environment of hope, a connection between belief and biology, and a commitment to caring for the person, not just the disease. Their library may have turned to dust, but their philosophy, in fragments and echoes, was woven into the fabric of medicine itself. It survived not on papyrus, but in the persistent human understanding that to heal a body, you must also attend to the spirit within it. Perhaps the most tantalizing possibility lies not in the dusty earth, but in the silent hum of a server farm. What if we could use the technology of tomorrow to reassemble the library of yesterday? This is the frontier of digital archaeology, where artificial intelligence is not just a tool, but a new kind of scholar, one capable of reading 1,000,000 pages in the time it takes us to read one. The idea is breathtakingly simple in concept, yet revolutionary in scope. Imagine feeding an artificial intelligence system every surviving word of ancient Greek and Roman medicine we possess. The entire Hippocratic corpus, every known work of Galen, the writings of Celsus and Dioscorides, and even the transcribed texts of those 70 miracle inscriptions from Epidaurus. The artificial intelligence would not read for meaning as we do, but for patterns, for invisible fingerprints left by a lost school of thought. Its task would be to find the ghost in the machine. The artificial intelligence could be programmed to search for clusters of unique terminology, phrases or descriptions of treatments that appear frequently in one set of texts but are rare or absent in others. For instance, it might detect that certain complex compound remedies, ones involving very specific combinations of 3 or 4 herbs, are described in a particular stylistic way in later texts attributed to physicians from the region of Kos or Pergamon. It could then cross-reference this with the Ayamata inscriptions, looking for any symbolic dream elements that might correlate to the ailments those compounds were meant to treat. A dream of a cool serpent coiling around a fevered brow, mentioned on a stone at Epidaurus, might linguistically and thematically cluster with numerous references to willow bark preparations in the pharmacological writings of later authors who trained in that region. The artificial intelligence would not be interpreting the symbol, but mathematically linking its occurrence to a material treatment across a vast sea of data. Furthermore, this digital tool could analyze the archaeological record in a new way, by cataloging every surgical instrument found at temple sites, along with precise data on their design, metal composition, and wear patterns. The system could compare this physical evidence to the descriptions of surgeries in the textual record. It might identify a gap, a procedure described in vague terms by Galen that perfectly matches the unique shape of a forceps found only at the Asclepieion of Corinth. This would be a digital fingerprint, suggesting that specific technique originated in that lost temple context before being absorbed into the general medical tradition. The goal would not be to magically generate the original scrolls word for word, an impossible feat. Instead, it would be to reconstruct the contours of the lost knowledge, to draw a silhouette around the absence. We could potentially map which ailments the Asclepieions specialized in, which surgical tools were pioneered there, and which botanical families their herb gardens favored most heavily. We might even see the faint outline of their diagnostic philosophy, how often dreams of binding led to bandages, or visions of cleansing waters led to specific hydrotherapies. This digital resurrection faces profound challenges, of course. The data is fragmentary and often filtered through later authors with their own biases. The ancient Greek language itself is fluid, and metaphors can be misleading. An artificial intelligence might falsely link the poetic description of a wound like an open mouth to actual treatments for oral ailments, missing the symbolic meaning entirely. The human scholar's intuition and cultural understanding would always be needed to guide the inquiry and interpret the artificial intelligence's cold, statistical correlations. Yet, this partnership between human curiosity and machine analysis offers a flicker of hope where before there was only dust. It proposes a future where we might not find the library, but we could finally read its catalogue, understanding the scope and specialty of the wisdom that was lost, and in doing so, appreciate its true shape for the very first time. This digital search for a ghost library speaks to something deeper in us, a collective fascination with what has vanished. The lost medical texts of the Asclepieions have become more than a historical puzzle. They are a cultural icon, a symbol. We are drawn to stories of lost knowledge because they force us to confront the terrifying fragility of everything we know. Think of the legendary Library of Alexandria, a name that instantly conjures an image of catastrophic fiery loss. That library represents a single dramatic point of failure, a great burning that we can picture. The Asclepieian texts represent a different, quieter kind of tragedy. Theirs was not a sudden conflagration, but a slow, systemic fading, a death by 1,000 cuts, conquest, neglect, censorship, and decay. This makes their story in some ways more haunting because it feels more inevitable, a reminder that knowledge can erode just as easily as it can explode. This specific mystery taps into a powerful modern longing. In a world of fragmented healthcare and often impersonal medicine, the idea of the Asclepieion represents a perfect, holistic ideal. We imagine a place where healers listened not just to symptoms, but to dreams, where treatment addressed the mind and spirit as intently as the body, and where healing happened in serene, beautiful spaces designed for that sole purpose. The loss of their texts feels like the loss of that ideal itself. It symbolizes a wisdom we sense we once possessed, a more connected, human-centered approach to health that was somehow swept away by history. Their disappearance becomes a poignant metaphor for our own endless search for better, more complete well-being. You can see this resonance everywhere in popular culture. Countless novels, films, and video games revolve around the quest for lost ancient knowledge, a forgotten book or formula that holds the key to saving the world or curing a plague. These stories are thrilling because they promise redemption, the chance to recover a golden age solution to a modern problem. The Asclepieian Library is a perfect, real-world anchor for that fantasy. It was not a mythical cure-all, but a vast, practical archive that genuinely existed. Its absence creates a tantalizing blank space in our story, a gap we are compelled to fill with our imagination. We wonder if we could just find those scrolls, what forgotten cures might we rediscover? What profound insights into the mind-body connection did they possess that we are still struggling to articulate today? This enduring allure is about more than just medicine, it is about narrative. Human history is full of gaps and silences, lost languages, destroyed artworks, and erased cultures. The Asclepieian texts are one of those eloquent silences. They represent the chapters torn from our own book, the questions we can never fully answer. Their mystery forces us to acknowledge how much of the human past is built on fragments and echoes, and how the story we tell is always shaped by what has survived the relentless filter of time. We are left, then, not just with a historical detective story, but with a reflection on our own place in that story, forever searching the shadows of the past for the light we feel has gone out. The silence left by these vanished scrolls is not an empty void, but a space filled with urgent, driving questions. What specific clues do modern researchers still chase in the dust, hoping to finally hear a whisper from that lost library? The first and most personal mystery concerns the daily tools of the healer priests themselves. We have found their public stone monuments and their bronze surgical kits, but where are their private notebooks? These would have been the most valuable texts of all, the working documents carried by a senior physician as he moved between patients in the abaton. Imagine a wax tablet or a scrap of papyrus, hastily noting a patient's symptoms upon arrival, the details of their dream, and the specific herbal formula prescribed the next morning. These ephemeral records, constantly updated and referenced, would have been the direct source material later compiled into more formal temple archives. Their complete absence suggests they were either too fragile to survive or, more intriguingly, were deliberately destroyed or removed when the temples closed, perhaps taken by the last generation of healers as their most prized professional possessions. Could a bundle of such personal codices still lie undiscovered, sealed within a family tomb or hidden in a cave near a sanctuary, waiting to rewrite our understanding of ancient clinical practice? This leads to a second, tantalizing possibility that keeps archaeologists awake at night. Could an entire library chamber simply have been walled up and forgotten? At a massive complex like the Asclepieion of Pergamon, with its labyrinthine tunnels and multi-level terraces, the idea is not so far-fetched. When imperial decrees ordered the sanctuaries closed, the resident priests may have faced an agonizing choice. Rather than see their sacred texts burned or defaced, they might have chosen to secretly seal the entrance to a scriptorium or storage room, hiding the core of their knowledge in the hope of a future return that never came. Modern ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive survey techniques are now being used at these sites not just to find new buildings, but to search for anomalies, hollow spaces behind thick walls that no shovel has yet breached. The dream is to one day peer into a void and see the faint, rectangular shadows of shelves, still lined with the cylindrical forms of scroll jars. A third frontier lies far from Greece in the dry sands of Egypt. The desert climate is a perfect preserver of papyrus, and countless fragments of everyday documents have emerged from ancient garbage dumps. Scholars meticulously sift through these pieces, and while most are tax receipts or personal letters, the hope persists that a fragment might surface referencing an Asclepieian protocol. Perhaps a letter from a Greek doctor working in Roman Egypt, writing home to Kos for advice on a complex case, quoting a temple treatment. Or maybe a merchant's inventory listing the export of medicinal herbs specifically labeled for the sanctuary at Epidaurus. Such a scrap would be a smoking gun, directly linking the material culture of Egypt to the operational manuals of the healing temples. To pursue these threads, research has become fiercely interdisciplinary. It is no longer just archaeologists with trowels and philologists with dictionaries. Today, teams bring in medical historians to analyze the descriptions of symptoms in the iamata, comparing them to modern clinical profiles. Botanists study pollen samples taken from the soil of temple gardens to reconstruct the exact flora that was cultivated. Materials scientists analyze the residues found inside ceramic medicine jars, using chemistry to identify traces of opium, mandrake, or willow compounds. This is detective work on a molecular level. Each field contributes a piece of the puzzle, slowly building a more complete picture of the system from the outside in, since the central texts remain elusive. The driving force behind all this effort is a fundamental human need to complete the story. The lost medical texts of the Asclepieions represent one of history's great unfinished chapters. Their absence is a constant, quiet provocation, a reminder that our past is a manuscript with missing pages. Every unanswered question, from the location of a single physician's notebook to the potential of a sealed chamber, ensures that the mystery remains vibrantly alive, not as a relic but as an active pursuit. The search itself becomes a tribute to the value of what was lost, a promise that we are still listening for an echo across 2,000 years of silence. From the tranquil terraces of Kos to the frantic digital searches of the modern age, our journey has spanned a silent chasm in human knowledge. We have walked the grounds of the lost hospitals, handled the surgeon's tools, and tried to decode the stone-carved miracles. Yet the central library, the intellectual heart of 1,000 years of healing, remains a profound and tantalizing absence. The disappearance of the Asclepieian medical texts stands as one of history's most resonant what-ifs. What if those scrolls had survived the Roman conquests, the religious revolutions, and the slow decay of time? Would our timeline of medical discovery look radically different? Would we possess a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the ancient mind, or perhaps a forgotten botanical cure that could challenge our modern pharmacopoeia? We are left with echoes, shadows, and the haunting silhouette of a wisdom we can only partially reconstruct. Perhaps, then, the most enduring legacy of these sanctuaries is not a specific technique or recipe, but the powerful, timeless idea they perfected. The concept of a true sanctuary for healing, a dedicated place where the environment soothes the spirit as treatment, addresses the body, where the patient's story is heard as carefully as their symptoms are observed. This holistic ideal of caring for the whole person in a space designed for hope is their gift that no fire could destroy. It is a philosophy that continues to shape, however imperfectly, our own aspirations for medicine. So we leave you with a final question, a thought to carry from this ancient mystery into our own time. If by some miracle a sealed chamber was discovered tomorrow and those lost scrolls were finally read, what do you believe would be their most shocking revelation? Would it be a surgical procedure far ahead of its time, a psychological insight we are only now rediscovering, or simply the profound, quiet humanity of the healers themselves? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to join us as we explore more of history's greatest puzzles, be sure to subscribe.